Hi class, this is Christoph, and I just wanted to do a brief video to talk about the idea of the carceral state. This idea is central for the readings that you've been doing in the first civil right. And the carceral state this idea has emerged within the past 2 decades as an important frame for thinking about mass incarceration. The central insight is that a nation such as the US, which has the largest prison population in the world, cannot pursue such a path without experiencing severe effects in every aspect of society. Just as a few brief examples, how our communities develop, how we draw electoral maps, the allocation of state and federal resources, the ways in which people of specific racial, ethnic, and gender identities are policed, and even our policies around migration and deportation and the experience of democracy itself is profoundly affected by mass incarceration. So I want to talk about what this particular term allows us to bring into view. At its most basic, the carceral state is the state's capacity to police and cage. And I like the way Naomi Murakami draws upon the work of Catherine Beckett and Bernard Harcourt to think about the carceral state in this way. And here I'm going to paraphrase Naomi, that the carceral state is, quote, a liminal space or boundary where negative or disapproving moral judgment meets government-sanctioned punishment. I'll say that again. The carceral state is a liminal space or the boundaries where negative or disapproving moral judgment meets government-sanctioned punishment. Let's give a few examples of what these spaces look like. So when the carceral state moves beyond the criminal justice system, right, that's part of what we're looking at, these liminal spaces where it's beyond the criminal justice system, and it's a place where state institutions, policies, and personnel become part of the carceral state when they do certain kinds of things. So let's give some examples. When we require exclusion based upon a person's criminal justice status, such as disenfranchising formerly incarcerated individuals who had the status of felon, when those who are formerly incarcerated are excluded from higher education. Again, these are forms of exclusion based upon a person's criminal justice status. The use of prison or jail as a reprimand for issues beyond criminal law, such as imprisonment for non-payment of a consumer debt or legal financial obligations. The integration of criminal justice personnel into regular institutional practices, such as the police in public schools, or what we now know or have often referred to as school resource officers. This is a critical point in thinking about what we often call the school to prison pipeline, or as many scholars and activists have reframed that problem as not the problem of dropouts, but the problem of pushout through policies that are overly punitive and that criminalize young people. The other aspect or feature of the carceral state is when we deputize non-criminal justice personnel to enforce criminal law, such as with the Border Patrol or different kinds of patrols that happen at the border. And I would also add this: the carceral state is what we refer to when carceral values and carceral logics become increasingly and uncritically woven into the institutions that make up civil society. The carceral state also offers us another political and historical vantage point to talk about mass incarceration. So historians in particular have begun to really focus on how the prison was conceived as a modern invention as part of the Enlightenment ideal of liberty. And so what you have then is the idea of freedom and liberty, and the prison or captivity becomes its negation. So it's a kind of twin, right? So that captivity was central to the ideas of American freedom in particular. So from the very beginning, prison and slavery defined the boundaries of citizenship from the very beginning. One way to think about this is when you look at conservative politics and the history of conservative politics, there's always a way in which the language of slavery is used to talk about the ways in which maybe the federal government infringes upon a person's liberties. And so the way in which often you'll hear on in conservative circles, or especially conservative talk radio, Obamacare as a form of slavery, different kinds of health, financial benefits, whether it is financial assistance for those who are homeless or who only make a certain level of income. All of these tend to get framed under the language of slavery, right? So this is what we're kind of historians are picking up on when they use the language of the carceral state. They're mapping the use, the social use of forms of captivity, forms of unfreedom, forms of or the use of jails and prisons as it relates to the question of citizenship. Now, we should also note that scholars such as Orlando Patterson and Angela Davis have been really probing this idea for some time. In particular, they would argue that a new understanding of freedom must be developed from those who have been on the underside of the modern project, those who have been on the underside of societies that claim to uphold the values of freedom and democracy while still being dependent upon significant portions of their population being either enslaved, incarcerated, in some form of captivity, or some form of unfreedom. So, a little closer to home, to where our concerns are, is that the carceral state allows a longer historical picture to come into view that sees the causes of mass incarceration as not reducible to the war on drugs or solely limited to conservative or Republican politics. So there's a way in which the carceral state allows us to view mass incarceration from a more bipartisan lens. More specifically, it also brings into view that programs such as the War on Poverty and other society-wide movements to address inequality also have often included aspects that were deeply wedded to the ideas of social control and fears about urban disorder in general and of African Americans in particular. Another figure that does a lot of work around the idea of the carceral state, I just want to touch on, and that is a political scientist by the name of Marie Gottschalk. She describes three features of the carceral state. One is the sheer size of its prisons and jail populations, and the other is its reliance on harsh and degrading sanctions and the persistence and centrality of the death penalty. And those often scholars and activists who are working with the idea of the carceral state, some of them also want to challenge what some have called the standard story. And that is a story that has largely been a consequence of the work of Michelle Alexander. And so one of the kind of critical points of contention or challenge is the idea of what we call the non-nons. Right? And Marie Gottschalk focuses on this. She argues that many reforms and social justice advocates have focused on what she calls the nonviolent, non-serious, and non-sexual offenders. This is what she refers to when she says the non-nons, right? Nonviolent, non-serious, and non-sexual offenders. Her concern is this. This language, or the focus on nonviolent offenders, has done a lot to pique the interest of a broader public. It's done a lot of work in getting people to recognize some of the profound injustices within our criminal justice system. However, there is an ambiguity kind of embedded in focusing on the nonviolent drug offender. And the ambiguity is this. When you look at someone who is in jail or in prison because of a particular offense or an arrest, the ambiguity is whether or not we want to take that moment in time and make that the essential profile or the essential core of an individual. Another way to say that is this. We've seen a shift from separating the criminal or the person from the criminal act, which opens the door to the possibility of redemption, possibility of rehabilitation. And we've seen a shift to the crime as the essence of the person or the criminal. The problem with this is that it is the case that someone may be incarcerated for a nonviolent offense who may also have a violent history. And someone may be incarcerated for a violent offense that does not have a violent history. So once again, when we're thinking about even the war on drugs, one of the consequences of illegal markets is that they do not have a legal means of settling disputes. And so illegal markets, whatever they may be, always attract forms of violence. So Marie Gottschalk wants to trouble the ways in which the non-nons may actually reinscribe the categories of good and bad that ultimately inhibit dismantling the carceral state, precisely because we don't want to see those offenses as part of our larger social problems or part of our larger cultural values. So in other words, the concern here is that if we really want to dismantle the carceral state, we may have to look beyond simply the focus on nonviolent drug offenders, because you can release all of the nonviolent drug offenders, but you would still have a very, very sizable prison population. So it's going to take some other broader shifts for us really to think about moving beyond the carceral state. I'd like to give an example. I think Marie Gottschalk gives a good example of why it's helpful to think in terms of the carceral state. It allows us to make connections that maybe wouldn't exactly seem intuitive. And I also just want to throw in here too the language of governance. I use that language in my own work, and I think it's helpful because sometimes when we talk about the state, to the credit of a number of political scientists, we have to remember that what we have as it relates to criminal justice is a number of overlapping systems, right? So there's federal, state, county, city. So we really have to be discerning if we're thinking about how we go about the work of social justice to look at kind of which systems we're talking about. So again, I want to give this one example of how Marie Gottschalk thinks about the carceral state. And she says this, and this is concerning the question of reentry. Right? She says, if you care about reentry and about keeping people out of prison in the first place, there's no public policy that you should support more strongly now than Medicaid expansion. Medicaid expansion gives states huge infusions of federal money to expand mental health services, substance abuse treatment, and medical care for many of the people who are most likely to end up in prison. It also allows states and localities to shift a significant portion of their correction health care costs to the federal tab. Medicaid funding that could provide real second chances to people released from prison many of whom, truth be told, never had a first chance. And as an example, in 2012, Congress allotted $63 million for the Second Chance Act. That's less than $100 for each person released from prison or jail that year, compared to the $100 billion that Texas will leave on the table over the next decade if they opt out of Medicaid. So again, just want to give that example of the way in which the carceral state and focusing on the question of governance allows us to not only look at jails and prisons and courts and policing, but also how that entire complex, if you will, of the criminal justice system is tied into, right, civil society. Now, you will also hear the language of the prison industrial complex, looking at all the financial and political incentives, right, that keep our prison population high. But again, I don't want us to lose that sense of civil society dealing with, social work, issues related to public assistance, issues related to public schools. All of those are ways of thinking about, again, how the carceral state, how the criminal justice system begins to essentially uh, infect, if you will, become woven into the structures of civil society. Okay. Thank you so much.